Hey, welcome back to the Fuse Show, everybody. My name is Bud. I am Chief of Staff at Xfusion.io and co-host of the Fuse Show. I am excited to be joined today by my guest, James Kaplan. James is co-founder and CEO of MeetKai, a conversational AI voice assistant and search engine shaping the next generation of artificial speech intelligence. James, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Bud. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Hey, I read that when you were 6 years old, you had a passion for AI and coding.
Yeah.
I have a 7-year-old, and she has a passion for playing in the sand and throwing it up in the air. How did you have a passion for coding and AI at 6? That's something a little bit different, I think.
So back then, I really enjoyed games. I mean, games back then, much simpler than games that people have these days. But, in particular, I don't know if you remember the Oregon Trail games that were like,
oh yeah,
very standard sort of like take a board game, put it onto a computer and make it a computer game. And I thought that was so cool. Like, because all of my experience with games prior to Oregon Trail were just board games, which I loved. But it was like my first, I don't want to call it like a grown-up board game, but it wasn't like, checkers or anything else like that. And I just found it so interesting, like, how did the game flow? How did you go to these different areas and run into these different problems and what was happening on the other end? And that's kind of what motivated me to start thinking about like game AI. And, like it was nice because back then it was so simple. The way AI worked back then was really like different decision trees and different paths. So it was really easy, even as a kid, to start seeing, oh, it checks if this is true and then does that. It's just a bunch of conditionals. So that kind of got me on that path of like thinking about, how is AI working? And, back then I didn't know it was AI. I just thought it was the bot. That was the bot. And that was kind of something that I always liked. I mean, from then on, I always liked games and I always liked thinking about how the bots worked in those games. I mean, kids these days, though, I see, they play Roblox and things like that. And people go pretty crazy there with what's possible. So I think that, it's just the way people will look at games and the way people interact with games kind of, I think, motivates that type of thinking of understanding how things are working underneath.
That's fascinating. I played that game and I didn't think of any of that. I just thought I better shoot the squirrel and feed my kids so I don't get, diphtheria and die. So right away I can tell our brains think a little bit different, which is great because we need that. So you wrote your first bot at 9 years old. Now, for those of us that are less informed, and I'm going to put my hand up here, I am not a coder. I am not anyway on that side. Like I said, I'm the chief of staff. I am the person that deals with the people in the company. I am not on that side of it at all. What exactly is a bot? How does it relate to the AI? Can you explain that to me and the viewers?
Sure. So, the bot I wrote back then, I think it was for Neopets, but just in general, a bot is intended to be a way of replicating what a human would do if the human were doing the same actions. And, that doesn't necessarily need to just be games. I mean, these days, there's like sneaker bots, where what they do as a task is they go to a sneaker site, wait for something to show up in stock, click the add to cart, click the buy button, and that's a bot. And it's really just any task at all like that, where humans are doing the steps, but it's very tedious. There's not much like creativity happening. They're just following a flow. Like those were kind of the standard bots. And these bots for a long time have been used for people trying to, I don't want to say cheat, but kind of cheat in games where, a lot of tasks in video games are very repetitive. For MMOs for years, online games, they would have all these different types of repetitive tasks where, yes, a person could spend 8 hours going from point A to point B, doing something and then going back to point A. Or you could write a bot to automate that process and do it while you sleep. So, it's the evolution, though, has been that as games and other experiences have gotten more complicated, the steps and the tasks aren't so linear. I mean, like with the shoe bot, right? in the old days, I mean, one of the first bots that I was exposed to was actually for eBay, of like people having different bidding bots where it would check if this much time is left in the auction, bid this, and then it closes. But these days, there's a lot more things going on, even in these like e-commerce bots, like for tickets or sneakers or anything like that, where, you know, there might be multiple different shoes that open up at different times and different sizes with different inventories, and the bots have to make calculated decisions on which ones to pursue. So it's like, you know, bots are having to become more intelligent, and I think the line in my mind has always been that there didn't seem to be a clear through line between bots and their evolution and AI, but it started to become a necessity. And, you know, these bots are not welcome by the other side. I mean, when I was 9, I got banned from Neopets. And I mean, a few years ago, like for Pokemon Go, I actually wrote the first bot for Pokemon Go, and I got myself and like tens of thousands of people permanently banned. And it's like, it's always a game of cat and mouse. And, you know, the challenge is that like websites don't want bots, they want people. Games don't want bots, they want people. So people are having to do all these things when they're building bots to make them look like a person. You know, like for shoe bots, because such a fun thing is that like all the sites don't want all of their inventory to go to shoe bots that will then be scalped on secondary markets, because that sucks. So they implement all these types of things to try to detect if it's a person slowly navigating and moving their mouse from one part of the screen to the next part of the screen. Maybe they're getting their credit card number wrong, hitting a backspace, like all these types of things that we do as people when we're using e-commerce sites. They're trying to look for those types of signals, because a bot would never make a mistake, right? They would always directly click on the button as quickly as it loaded, etc. So then the bot makers see that and say, okay, we now have to make our bot look like a human. And at some weird point, it's like the bot is no longer just a simple way of repeating tasks, but starting to look like an actual form of artificial intelligence.
That just blows my mind. That's crazy. But it just reminds me that people are awesome, and the way that we think and do things is just cool. It's a form of evolution in science and computers. You know, it's just, I don't know, it blows my mind. I'm glad we have people like you out there that can figure this stuff out.
At the same time, though,
congratulations, and yeah, go ahead.
Like, I'm sorry. It just makes me think that, like, you know, a lot of these bots though aren't like, it's not like zero sum, because it's hurting other people. You know, when someone is putting together a bot to scout to get, you know, PS5s, that basically means that no one else who really wants to buy a PS5 can buy one, because it goes to the bots. And, you know, it's one of these things where it's like, when I first made a bot for a game, it was like a single player game. So I wasn't really hurting anyone. But at a certain point, it starts becoming this thing of like, Neopets, for example, had like an online economy. So if you're botting and collecting an unfair advantage over everyone else, then it starts hurting them.
Well, that's like with everything. Anything can be used for good,
yes,
or bad, right? I mean,
exactly.
Anything can. So it's just who's behind it and what's their value system and what do they want to do with it. So, nevertheless, the mind behind it, and yeah, it's just amazing to me what people can do. But yeah, you're right. Like, people can use it for good, people can use it for bad, and I mean, how do we figure that out, and how do we stop that? That's something that we need to figure out for sure. But so you wrote that Pokemon Go bot, you get kicked off. How old were you when you did that?
So Neopets was 9. Pokemon Go was like when it came out was it 2016, 2017? I don't know, time flies pretty quickly now.
Yeah, it does. So, okay, so you were...
I mean, I've been doing...
You were a little bit older.
Yeah.
Sorry. I keep interrupting.
No, it's fine. I was just thinking, like, bots have always been my kind of side project, to be honest, is like just through my entire, you know, life, just because I find them so fun and interesting. And, you know, it was one of those things where it's like, for some people, like programming, computer science, and things like that, there's like a moment where it like kind of clicks and you think, wow, this is so useful. For a lot of people, that's just like an automation where you see like before I could code, I was doing these like all these manual spreadsheets and all this like copying and pasting to all these different places. And then you realize, oh, I can just automate the entire task and save so much time by spending, an hour now, I will save 10 minutes a day for the rest of my life. And like for me, writing bots was that point where it kind of clicked for me in programming, where it's like, this is so cool. Otherwise, I would waste my time playing the game, but now I can write a bot instead and have it play for me. I mean, the downside of it is it maybe not like playing games as much anymore, but it was just an always interesting thing to see. And, I haven't since the Pokemon Go stuff done any bot work just because of, there's nothing really that's come out that's interesting to bot for. And that was like interesting just because of the scenario of like people moving around the world and how you simulate that from a bot, like just by spoofing the GPS coordinates as it's moving around. So it's just interesting as a challenge.
So is that kind of what got your juices flowing for AI? I mean, really, I know you, when you were 6, you were interested in AI, but I mean, is that really what got your juices flowing for, hey, I can really use AI to make a change? Or where did that interest really come from?
It's tricky. It's like, it's hard to think of like a specific moment where I'm like thinking, okay, AI versus bots versus programming. I've always liked math too. So it's always been one of those things where, I honestly did more math than I did CS initially. Since back then, like, there were no laptops or tablets or anything like that.
Sure.
I mean, there were laptops, but they were like clunky and all that. But in any event, AI to me means a lot of things. Because, it's really a spectrum. And it's kind of a term that can mean everything from like very simple types of AI, because a very simple problem can have an AI that solves it completely. Or you can have these scenarios where it's a very complicated problem, and we talk about like self-driving car AI, and it's not that good yet. So it's like,
right.
It's all still AI, but in some scenarios it's like shockingly good. Like for Go, where AI can dominate there in the game, versus self-driving cars, where we hear stories like every other week about self-driving car runs into stopped pedestrian. Like just like every week it seems like there's some new story like that. So it's, as an individual, I never thought of AI as like, okay, here's this like one thing that will solve all problems in humanity, but more so just like, wouldn't it be nice if, was kind of my motivator of like, wouldn't it be nice if we could have an automated solution for this? And AI kind of is that in many ways, since automated solution means, an intelligent solution where you're not necessarily like pre-programming all paths. Like to me, what AI really means, the difference between AI these days and what I think of as AI now compared to like Oregon Trail and those types of things, is in those scenarios, everything is modeled. There's a perfect understanding of the game of Oregon Trail where the computer can figure out like every single possible path that could be taken and what to do. You don't kill a squirrel, you get dysentery 3 turns later. Versus like these days, like for self-driving car, it's impossible to model everything and to predict everything because it's a dynamic real world environment where all the stuff's going on. So the agent, the AI, actually needs to understand the problem. It needs to understand what driving means. And like that's what's interesting me now in like in the space that we work in of like, how does AI understand language, as opposed to just like memorizing 180 million different ways of saying something? Because like that would be impossible, right? There's always going to be new ways to say something. There's always going to be new phrases that come up, new vocabulary, etc. But if you can try and teach it to understand language to a certain extent, then its capabilities suddenly become intelligent as opposed to just like seeming intelligent.
All right. Okay, so let's segue that into MeetKai. We'll come back and talk a little more about all that stuff. But let's go ahead and talk about MeetKai. Tell us, exactly what it is, what it does, and then we'll kind of get into the backstory of how it came to be.
Sure. So we started MeetKai, kind of goes with what it is at the same time, based on like sort of observing what the market looked like in terms of voice assistants. 3 years ago when we started, voice assistants out there, Siri, Alexa, Google, and then all the other players overseas were not really advancing. I mean, I personally remember when Steve Jobs went on stage and like announced, the iPhone 4S or something. And he was saying like, here is Siri. This is going to change the way everyone uses iPhones. And it was like, the big thing. And of course they had just acquired Siri as a company, but still like they were pitching it as like, this is the future of iPhone. But now, after the years went by, nothing really developed. The field wasn't moving forward rapidly in the same way that it was kind of promised. And, we saw that as kind of a real flaw. Because, like, if you look at how people perceive the iPhone's, like, different categories and facets, and, like, you look at, like, user satisfaction studies, then, almost every single feature that people have on an iPhone, they love. 80 to 90% of people like iMessage, 80% of people like FaceTime, like real high percentage numbers. And then for Siri, you get down to these like 15 to 20% of people like it. 70% of people don't know what it is. And it's like, what happened? And it's not like they gave up. It's just that it's really hard. And, I felt back then that the approach that they were taking wasn't going to have a future. Like they weren't on a pathway towards, true conversational AI. And I think for AI, what I've always believed is that, as I was saying before, it's about like actually teaching it to understand problems. And a lot of that for AI isn't necessarily starting out with the best thing. It's a matter of figuring out a way to create an intelligence that's on a pathway towards being better, and where every iteration of it is on that forwards pathway. And, based on what we saw in 2018, the systems out there were not on a forward path. They were just kind of in loops with themselves, where the end goal wasn't going to be AI. It was just going to be 1.1 or 1.2 or 1.3 of the chatbot. So, we saw that and we took that as kind of like an opportunity where we said, what if we just sort of started from scratch, didn't build off of old architectures and old approaches, and really built from the ground up, using new architecture and new methodologies. Could we not necessarily be the best from the start, and not necessarily have the most features from the start, but could we set ourselves up on a path where continued work and continued innovation was possible, and where that innovation and research would lead towards, these compounding effects towards true AI? And that's kind of what MeetKai is as a company, is this goal of like building true conversational AI where, we are constantly getting better. And our current offering so far, we have a number of different things out through partners as well. But one of our main B2C products is our voice assistant that we really kind of just launched to test the waters and see, what people would ask it, as opposed to it necessarily being a fully production product yet. And the feature that we're kind of showing off there is based on conversational search. Since, I keep saying conversational AI, but it's like a really big category. And, it's a phrase that means a lot to a lot of different people. And to us, at least, what it means is that any time that a human is having any form of like conversational input to any device, that's a type of conversational AI. And, it really covers the full spectrum as well, though, because it's like, imagine we had, doctor bots, right? Just hypothetically, a surgeon that could perform surgeries. Then there still needs to be some way where the human is going to interact with that surgeon bot and, ask them questions or anything else. There's always going to be a conversational element because we as humans prefer to talk. We don't necessarily prefer to like use a complicated menu. I think that was like the original appeal of voice assistants to me, is that, how is it that on phones where we now have to go like 7 layers deep to get to something, can we still not use our voice to get there and get there in a fraction of the time? And, that's like, was my motivation. And, it's was very hard because there's a reason why the other companies weren't moving forward, because it's such a hard space. But I think that we've kind of seen a bunch of different startups out there in a bunch of different fields. And I'd like to think of us as one of them that kind of show that if you, remove the, organizational friction that happens at a lot of these companies and these like fears and risk calculations at a lot of these companies, and just try to like do the hard work and be clever about how you do the hard work, then you can arrive at pretty cool solutions. And that's kind of what we've done.
Yeah, it is a pretty cool solution. I was telling you right before we came on that I downloaded MeetKai, and I've been playing with it, today before we came on the show. And, I've been using it, and it's not like, Siri. It's not like using Alexa. Definitely. I asked it, I live in a small town, and I'm like, well, this will be a pretty good test because it is a pretty small town out in the middle of nowhere. I'm like, give me a restaurant to eat at. I said, what do you think of J&L Cafe? I'm like, well, I like J&L Cafe, but I don't want to eat there today. Give me something else. I said, what do you think about Village Inn? And I said, no, I don't want to go to Village Inn. Give me something more high-end. I said, what do you think about Simpkins Parlor? I'm like, good Lord, this thing's doing pretty good. I'm like, that's pretty neat. Like, I could never do anything like that with Siri, Be like, give me a restaurant. Well, here's a list of restaurants in your area. So it was pretty neat. It was kind of fun to play with. So you're doing a pretty good job. I was like, well, that's pretty impressive for this little town out here.
It's fun because like that honestly is my favorite feature of the multi-turn. There's three categories of what behind the scenes of things I think that are especially interesting about what we've built so far. And in my mind, the coolest one is probably multi-turn, because multi-turn, the way most search engines work or voice assistants work is like you send a request, you get a response. That's it. That's how Google has worked forever. It's the white search bar. You want to change your search, delete it, do a new search. And, people have learned to like work into that frame of mind where like you see your results, then you delete your search and you like change the way you phrase it to try to get different results. And I always thought that was so silly because if you were dealing with a human, like humans are not stateless. Humans remember what you just said to them and know what you mean. So we built that in as the idea of like the unit of work is not a request, it's the entire dialogue. And part of that was to enable that idea of conversational search, but also it's part of kind of our bigger plans of, that same type of multi-turn interaction is like especially useful in like other day-to-day scenarios. Like you can imagine like one of these things that we haven't finished building yet, but we have like prototypes of is like for food ordering at like a restaurant. The entire process of like how you order from a menu is not single flow. Like it's not, I want a hamburger with no onions, pickles, blah, blah, blah. You don't say your entire order at once in one sentence. It's like you might ask for suggestions. You might say, wait, is that gluten-free? Like there's just all these different possible flows. And it's very much a multi-turn experience that you have. And, we wanted to build, like, I consider conversational AI to fundamentally be multi-turn. And, the duration of how many turns that is kind of open-ended. My eventual hope, like right now, there's limits based on computational power of you can't remember everything. Because, like, eventually the history becomes so large. But, eventually the goal is that we should be able to remember everything you've ever said in a way that as you keep using it, it understands and can preempt what you're asking. Right now, Siri doesn't do anything like that. And none of these systems do. And it's interesting because it's not for lack of trying, but it's just like, if you have an approach that you've built out, then it can put you into this hole where it's hard to add these new types of features. Versus for us, we started with this as a goal, which means that certain things are harder for us, but this one we can do. And, I think it's one of those things where it's like, eventually, if you look at it like the asymptotic thing at infinity of time of development, humans, if you can imagine having perfect memory of everything that someone has ever said to you, it's not necessarily like a perfect. It's not like you remember everything that, I've ever said in the past 30 minutes, but you have your own like distilled representation of things that I've said. So like, That's how I kind of think of it, is that like, we should look at trying to make this AI think like a human in some ways, of like understanding summaries of what I've just said and summaries of what I've said over the past month and year and how they've changed, as opposed to like literally remembering every single sentence.
That's fascinating. And you've built this from the ground up, right? Like you and your team have built this from the ground up. Like you haven't used a different platform or anything.
No, the only places
that's crazy
we use other platforms or solutions are in certain scenarios for speech to text and text to speech. I'm fairly, soundly of the opinion that those two fields are solved. Not solved, but like pretty solved.
Sure.
The quality of voices that get generated from text to speech now are like night and day compared to like, I remember having fun with like the, what was it, the Microsoft Say voice, where you could have it say random things 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and it's like, oh, this was so funny. But now the voices actually sound like a person. And, I think so we didn't really focus there. And on speech to text, initially we did it ourselves, and we do it ourselves for some languages. But it's one of those things where, the phones these days have speech to text built in as like a module. And, it's one of those things where I'm happy to delegate that to anyone else that wants to do it. Because at the end of the day, like from a privacy perspective, speech to text is also the most sensitive for people, I think. So it's one of those things where if we can get around doing it in the long term, we'd be super happy.
Nice. That's just all fascinating to me. So was it a conscious decision to go this way with the speech platform into AI, or was it something that you were looking around and you're like, this is where it's needed most? Was it a frustration thing? And like, do you guys want to stay with the speech platform, or eventually do you want to expand out and do different and more things, or is this your path?
So I think that, from the beginning we set out on this path because, I think that there's a lot more interesting things you can do with smaller amounts of data in like language compared to vision. And then, for AI in general, there's this overarching, like, I don't want to call it fact, but it's kind of a fact that the more data you have, the better. And, you hear about all these things about like how many hours of driving footage does Tesla train their cars on for the self-driving. And it's like some unbelievable number of like many millions a week or new hours are collected. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, you can't compete with that. And then you have other things for like images where you see like, Google collects every image that you ever take and uses that as part of its training. So we can't compete with that. But on the other hand, for language, that's one of the things where there's plenty of records of text that people have written online, in books, everywhere else. So it becomes one of those things where you can collect the type of data you need to train. You can collect the type of data you need to do understanding. And in fact, like, everyone out there, like of the, the big players, are using similar types of data sets that they're collecting online for language understanding. People are using all of the text from Wikipedia, all the text from crawling the top, 10 million most popular sites. There's like a full gauntlet of like different types of data. And, for us, like, that's another reason why I don't love speech to text, because if you want to be in the speech to text field, you need just ridiculous numbers of hours of people talking. And likewise for text to speech, if you want to do a custom voice and have your own voice, then you need to record someone for basically 20 to 24 hours talking and it's going through entire dictionaries of different ways of phrasing things, etc. But for language, we don't need any of that. And as a startup, we are a startup, right? So we have to be clever and pick and choose our battles for, like, what do we do? What do we focus on? So it's one of those things where it's like, do I see ourselves expanding beyond the framework that we're in? Yes. But I mean, I think that, right now we're still trying to see, how far we can stretch. Because I think a lot of fields that we don't necessarily think of as needing like this type of functionality now, we'll need it in like 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Well, sure. Yeah, I think that this is just the very tip of the iceberg. I mean, you look at what computers used to be able to do and what computers can do now. I think that's kind of a good, vision or analogy of what AI is, where it's come from and what it's going to be able to do. What are some misconceptions that people get with AI that you see people have about AI?
So I think the biggest ones that I've seen these days that I think are pretty important are understandings around bias. Since I think that's like really important and can't be ignored, but also the most important thing is to like understand how do you define it with respect to a model. Because I mean, we've seen in the news, I think it's been the past 6 months to 2 years basically, where this entire thing has been like, how do we know if models are biased? And then how do we address that bias? And there's all these types of examples. One of my favorite ones for like can kind of demonstrate bias pretty quickly is like if you translate sentences between different languages. You say something like, he is a doctor. You translate that to another language, and then you translate that to another one, and then you bring it back to English. It will say he's a doctor. However, if you say she is a doctor, then depending upon how the models translate it, when you bring it back to English, it could change it to he is a doctor. Because the model says, I've seen he is a doctor much more oftenly used than she is a doctor. Therefore, this is the correct sentence. And it's like one of those things where it's like, crap. That's bad.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's, it's not... I think the thing that people get as a misconception is that there's some magical trick that the researchers can do to fix it. It's really hard. Because, in my mind, it's not just a matter of, like, fixing it, it's a matter of finding it. Like, it's really hard to think and, like, challenge a model because it kind of becomes, like, challenging a person in some ways. Like, how do you determine if someone is biased? You have to ask them questions. You have to prod them. You have to see different ways that they interact with different questions. And, like, we have to do all of that same work with a model. And it's not like a turnkey, like, I'm going to make my model biased. It's something that I do when I train it. It's much more nuanced. And, I think that that's like a simple example. I mean, we also see it in sort of some more complicated places. Like, I know of a number of different like sensor companies that make camera lenses. And, one of the big things that's done is like, how do you do low light camera shots? And like, that's the big thing that everyone talks about on phones these days of like, I want my phone to take a picture at night and look great, like it's during the day.
Right.
So, these camera companies set off on this path, and a lot of what they do to do that is with AI to kind of have the lens and the processor of the phone be able to differentiate, where's the person from the background to do the adjustments of the levels. But if you take a company in China that might not think about, people having darker skin tones, then when they build out the product, it's going to inevitably not work well for people of color. And it's like, at that point, they didn't even think about it because they didn't know to think about it. It's a challenge, and I think there's a temptation we have, and what gives us that incorrect assumption about AI, to blame the researcher and blame the developer. But I think it's not so simple, unfortunately. And everyone would like it to be simple because then you could just say, don't be biased, and then the models will work. But it's just this constant balancing act. And, I think it's a long way to go. Unfortunately.
Sure. I get that. I I can see, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I can see this working a few different ways. But like lessening a language barrier with this, could this be used like to do that if you're, say, even like wartime, and you have a wounded warrior from, the enemy or something, they come in and they're in your camp and you're trying to help them, you're trying to save them, right? Or you're out and about in another country, you get hurt, you have to go to the doctor. Can you use something like this technology as a way to communicate with somebody else that you don't speak the same language? Is that possible?
I think eventually. I mean, the way I think of that type of a problem, and the way I see ourselves being applied to that, is that, the traditional sense of how people would approach that is through translation. That you would just translate from what person said to person said. But the big problem there, in my mind at least, is that, when you're doing that translation between parties, it's now on the other person to understand, well, what do they really mean? I mean, you can imagine hypothetically someone is saying, like, I'm constipated, I have diarrhea. And then the translation says the opposite. And then they give you the wrong type of medicine. That would be pretty bad.
Well, that would be bad.
And, because, someone's saying something, they say it in their own language, and the translation is, my stomach is bad. Not really helpful. I think that what could be done instead, and what is interesting to think about, is that the way our tech kind of works is that instead of looking at the text that was said, it's trying to extract the meaning at different levels. And that meaning is sort of progressively more detailed. And you can imagine building up like understandings of like this hierarchical set of like health intents, of like someone is saying, their problem. And instead of the AI trying to translate their problem to verbatim text to describe it in another language, it's instead just saying this person has diarrhea. How they tried to convey that in their original language, that they have diarrhea, is kind of irrelevant, right?
Sure.
All that really matters to the other side is that factual extraction. And I think that's kind of the, a possible end solution there. I mean, right now, our goal has been to try to take our tech into many different regions and languages to test ourselves in some ways, and see like how
which
far
you've done.
It's fun. It's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the idea of it, and the reason why we're kind of doing it in a way too, is that part of it is to demonstrate that it's not just like memorizing. If you're just memorizing, then sure, you could do pretty cool things for English, but how are you going to do that in French or German or Indonesian or Polish or Turkish? You need to have sort of more complicated forms of language understanding. And that's what we built. The other thing that we have that's kind of nifty for sort of cross-border work is that this isn't rolled out everywhere yet. Still something that we're doing in testing. But like, if you think about like a recipe, right? For, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a fun dish. Huevos rancheros, right? That recipe, no matter what country you're in or what language you speak, it's still really the same recipe, right? They're still the same components. Mm-hmm. All that changes are maybe the units of measure, maybe the directions, and more interestingly, maybe different ingredients are used for regions that don't have that type of ingredient. Maybe you're in some country that doesn't use, I don't know, olive oil as much, so it swaps it with canola oil or Crisco or anything else. Like, there's some sorts of adjustments there. But at the end of the day, the recipe is multilingual. Well, not multilingual, I should say it's absent language. And right now, these days with Google, when you search for recipes, you're finding recipes on a recipe site, right? What we want to do instead is kind of enable this idea of like, you're finding a factual description of a recipe that anyone in the world could also consume. And honestly, one of my motivations for that is that like, I really like cooking Asian food. But like, if you go and look for recipes in the US for Chinese food versus you go on a Chinese recipe site and use Translate to bring it to English, you see very different types of recipes.
I bet.
And it's like, why can't we bridge that gap? these are still recipes. And like that's been a motivation of mine for a long time. And, if you think about the world as it was seen by search engines in the past, it's that there's a bunch of different documents. A web page is a document. Our method and way of thinking about it is it's not documents that people want anymore, it's items. You don't want to get to the homepage for that restaurant. You want the restaurant. And why should it be the case that, if someone only speaks Korean in your small town, they can't also find that restaurant? And they can with this approach. Yeah. And like that's the, fun part for me in some ways about different regions and different languages is that it kind of unlocks new content. I've always wondered, like, can you imagine how much content is produced in other countries that we have no idea about that we might love? I mean, maybe there's some Chinese podcast that would be perfectly appealing to you that you've never heard of and would never know about, because it's only in China. And maybe your show would be very interesting to someone in Thailand, but they have no way of finding out about it. So it's like all these different things of like content right now that as much as, companies like to talk about how they've opened the door for everyone, information everywhere, et cetera, it's still kind of siloed in languages and regions. And big reason for that is not because of any real desire to have it be siloed, but just because the only way to find them is by searching for them on Google in their language.
I have to ask, I have a feeling that your mind never rests. I have a feeling that you're just kind of always go, go, go. Do you ever just take a break? Like, do you ever just let yourself kind of relax? I wonder, like, how do you see the world? When you're out and about walking, do you listen to people talk and are you like, man, I can help. I could do something with that. Or I could, see how people interact and you're like, man, I could fix that. I just have a feeling that's the way you are.
I thank you for that. Yes, I like thinking that way. I like to ask a lot of questions. I mean, even about things that aren't really in my comfort zone. I saw someone using one of those hydrojets on a drain to get out the roots. I was fascinated, so I walked up and had a conversation about how do those nozzles work.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it's I probably should take breaks because they say all those things about if you are so focused on something, then you have tunnel vision and you miss potential opportunities and potential interest things. But there's just so much, I guess, inefficiencies that I see in the world. And prior to this company, I was in finance. I dropped out of college actually to start a hedge fund. And a lot of it was inefficiencies that I saw. And for that, what we did was option pricing for the market. There's all of these different options at all of these different prices for all of these different companies for all these different dates. And I thought, look at all these inefficiencies there are. Look at all these different ways that people are not seeing the connections and the dots. And why can't we be more efficient? Why can't things be connected? But then, that I could I have kept going there and continued finding inefficiencies and doing things? Yes. But at a certain point, I wanted to do something more interesting that had more applications and more types of efficiencies compared to just making sure that, there was optimal pricing of volatility risk. So, it's definitely something I do a lot of, just looking for problems or just thinking about them. And I enjoy it. I mean, it's...
Well, that's obvious.
Thank you. I mean, it's fun. It's fun to think about, and it's one of those things where, I think the most interesting companies are those where, you're not stuck in your way of your definition of what the business is. I think we've seen that, and there's always fun examples of different companies that really do radically different things, but they still have fun with them. And I mean, I think that, if you look at Google as a company and Alphabet, there's the side of Larry Page and Sergey Brin that like doing random stuff. If you look at their laundry list of projects that they've done, some of them are ridiculous. You think, how could this have been a thing that they thought would work? but sometimes it pans out, sometimes it doesn't. And I think that I like that type of approach of thinking, of like, just try new things, try, moonshots. And in many ways, our company's a moonshot in that it's either going to work and be really cool and do lots of things, or the tech won't work. And that was how we started. And I think we've done a good job of moving away from the tech won't work and into we can do really cool things. But, part of never stopping and part of like always looking for things and solutions and problems is being willing to actually try and fail. If you only see things where you think I can help and then don't, or don't try anything there, then, what's the point? Then you're just kind of having thought exercises.
Yeah. So, with that, how do you balance your work-life schedule, or do you just keep focused on work, or do you have a work-life balance?
Probably not as much as I should, and I think that this is, I often ask other like startup founders of different companies and things like that, like, how do they have work-life balance? For me, at least, honestly, before the pandemic, I had a slightly more stable work-life balance. And I think many people are the same way. Like, before the pandemic, There was, like, some stability. And I think that since the pandemic, it's been trickier because there's this idea of, like, you can always be at your desk. And more of the people in our company are always at their desk. And it's just this sort of fun thing of, like, there's always work to be done. And, like, these days now, we work with companies in, India, Europe, Asia, Indonesia, China, Hong Kong, Mexico. So there's always, like, people up. So there's always this temptation I have, like, okay, I can call this person and start working. And, my co-founder is kind of the same way in that, she was in Italy, actually, for her son's wedding. And, it was like, yes, it's 2 a.m. for her, but isn't that fine? Because she can go on to our afternoon call with so-and-so. And it was like, it's a hard place to be, though, because I think the risk is burnout, right? Like, that's always the risk.
Sure.
And I'm of the opinion, though, that burnout, I think people feel when you are working really hard towards something and that thing is never coming. Like, there's no forward progress. And I think that's what makes people feel the burnout the worst. Of, like, they're doing all of this grind, let's say they're building some feature and then the feature disappears. And, like, I think that as long as I'm, making forward progress, then I don't mind about the work-life balance. And I think that, like, for, most people out there is, like, startup people that I've talked to, is, like, they feel kind of similarly. Of, like, as long as things are, moving forward, then it's good. It's when things aren't moving forward, or, like, when you're in a rut, that you need that work-life balance to kind of reset yourself. Because if you're not moving, even if it's like, like you think about the angle, right? Even if it's only like a 5-degree angle upwards, then that the more time you put in, the higher you'll get.
Sure.
But when you're at that, like, 0 degree where it feels like even if I put in 1,000 more hours, it's not going to make any difference, that's when you need to get that real balance.
Yeah. So when I first started here, we were in the middle of a 5-month rut where we didn't bring on any customers. And, it was, we knew we know that we're playing the long game, right? And we knew that we would get more, but it was starting to get frustrating, And then all of a sudden we had 4 come on at the same time. And then we're just like, okay, so this is what it feels like.
Yeah.
We know that we're going to have those times where we go 4 or 5 months, maybe 6, where we don't have any new customers come on, and then, that's just kind of what this is what we look like, This is how we do it. So I understand what you're saying. So we felt like we were on that 0 degree, but that's actually what our incline looks like.
2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree.
Right.
But it's still up. So that's the key.
And now we understand that, and so I get what you're saying. Like, it's not. I don't think that we were at burnout, but we're like, man, this sucks.
Yeah.
But then that came, and they're like, okay, we understand what this looks like. So then we got on another, 3-month stint, and we're like, no, we're good because we know it's coming.
Yeah.
So, no, I get it. So do you have any hobbies or interests that you like to do away from work that just kind of takes your mind off work? Or
I like cooking, and I mean, I haven't been as good since the pandemic started with fitness. Mainly because, you can take a very trying to think of a way that does make me seem weird, methodologic, like calculated way of thinking about it, where, for a while I was very into like making ice cream. And I was just so fascinated by like, how can you make ice cream that tastes the best? Like, what is it? Because I think we've all, who doesn't like ice cream, right?
Right.
And everyone has preferences though for different ice creams. And I was just interested because like, why is it that I like this ice cream more? And it's one of those things where there's infinite information online. You can find out how every different ice cream is made. So I went into this long rabbit hole of like, okay, how do you get the right mouthfeel? How do you get the right, defrost rate? Because if you make ice cream and, your fat content is off, then the way it defrosts from the freezer is terrible and it doesn't taste good. So it's like, I could go down this long route of optimizing the ice cream. And, I like that type of stuff. I did that with baking once, cookie recipes, brownie recipes, baguettes, sourdoughs. It's just, I think even though it's not this and not programming, it's still the same type of like, desire to understand something and desire to kind of crack it.
Sure.
Where it's like, the one, you can never crack it though for cooking because you can always do better. But it's just always fun to think about like, what makes something good? Just no matter where you are in the world, like what makes something good is something that can be discovered, teased out, and optimized. And cooking has the virtue of being able to happen instantly. If I said what makes, a mattress good, I mean, I don't know what I would do there. I can't make a mattress. But if you just think like what makes for a good donut, well, you can try 50 different ways in a week.
Right. So what is your favorite ice cream?
So my focus back then was thinking like, how do you make high protein ice cream that doesn't taste terrible? Because this was like before the, the fad of like Halo Top and all those types of healthy ice creams. And it was like, I love eating ice cream. But I don't, and I want to be able to eat an entire pint of ice cream and not feel bad about it. And it was thinking like, well, we have high protein, everything else. Why can't we optimize this? So it was mainly trying to think of ways of like getting the ice cream to taste like ice cream, without sacrificing like the fat content. Because the thing that makes ice cream bad for you is either your sugar content or your fat content, and balancing that. So it's like the idea of like, you don't want to use too much artificial sweetener because then it just tastes off. And everyone can tell it's off because of the way that artificial sweetener freezes. So there's all these different types of things I had fun with the sugar alcohols, and, it made me dislike ice cream a lot because I just ate it so much every day. But, it's fun. When I'm not caring, though, I love Ben & Jerry's. Their toppings are good.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's, it's so delicious because of all the different toppings. They don't really care about the mouthfeel, and I don't even think about the mouthfeel.
You just like all this stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I'm just boring. I just like a nice vanilla ice cream.
I mean, there's lots to be said about that. I was, soft serve is all the rage now in LA.
Yeah.
Where it's just soft serve, no toppings.
Yeah. There's something to be said for a good soft serve ice cream cone. But, well, I think we're going to have to start landing this plane because you've got another call here coming up in a little while. So we'll ask you a couple more questions.
Sure.
And then we'll get out of here. I like to ask these to everybody that's on this. So what advice would you give to founders or soon-to-be founders that are going to be watching this?
Don't be afraid. I think that the thing that most people worry about when they're doing a startup is either A, is it already done? B, will someone come in and do it at the same time as me? Or like C, is someone going to see I'm doing it and then do it? And it's that if you are already questioning yourself then you don't have the, like you failed before you started. And I think that like, no matter what you do as a startup, very rarely are you going to be the first person to ever attempt something. And very rarely are you going to be the only person attempting it. So you have to just kind of accept that competition will occur, but still try and do it your own unique way. And like, I think that at the same time, I would say don't overstudy your competitors. Because like, you'll just end up thinking like them and making the same mistakes. You should like instead look towards like who their users are and study them and understand them. I mean, let's say you're doing, just any startup really. It's think about who your users, your customers are, and let that be what defines you, not your competitors.
Nice. I like that answer. And then, what is the best way for our viewers to get in touch with you if they would like?
So, I have a Twitter account. I should use my Twitter more often and just only mention it in certain places. So yeah, Twitter. I'm on Twitter.
All right. Sounds good.
At JEK.
And then you can. Okay. And then you can go to MeetKai, MEETKAI.com, and you can check out their website. It's a nice looking website. It gives lots of information. Like I said, I downloaded the app, started playing with it. I'd suggest you guys do the same thing. It's a lot of fun. It's quite a different experience than you'll get from using Siri. James, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it. Had a good time.
Thank you, bud. Thanks for having me.